these markings on the ground here in the mountains of Ararat, that these are the last remnants of Noah's Ark, kind of shipwrecked, if you like, here on this mountainside.
Scientists have spent decades searching the mountains of eastern Turkey for evidence connected to one of the oldest flood traditions in human history. But the real story is more complicated than the headlines suggest. There is no archaeological excavation that has uncovered Noah's Ark. No laboratory has authenticated a surviving piece of Ark timber. And no scientific institution has confirmed that a strange formation near Mount Ararat is the remains of a biblical vessel. What does exist is a remarkable geological formation, decades of investigation, increasingly sophisticated geophysical surveys, unusual soil measurements, and a research team that believes the site deserves a much closer examination. At the center of that investigation is the Durupanar Formation in Ara Province, eastern Turkey. And this time, the question isn't simply whether the formation looks like a ship. The question is, what is actually beneath it? Before we go any further, please subscribe to the channel and help us reach our goal of 5,000 subscribers. The formation that looks like a ship. In 1959, Turkish Army Captain İlhan Durupanar was examining aerial reconnaissance photographs of eastern Turkey when he noticed an unusual elongated feature near Mount Ararat. From above, it looked remarkably like the outline of a massive boat. The formation lies near the village of Uzungili, roughly south of Mount Ararat, in a mountainous region shaped by volcanic and sedimentary processes. It is approximately 157 meters, or about 515 feet, long. That measurement immediately attracted attention because Genesis 6:15 gives Noah's Ark a length of 300 cubits. Depending on the ancient cubit standard being used, that biblical measurement is commonly converted to somewhere around 450 to 515 feet. The similarity is intriguing, but there is an important archaeological rule here. A matching measurement is not proof of an ancient ship. A geological formation can have dimensions that happen to resemble those described in an ancient text. And that is precisely why the Durupanar site has remained controversial for more than half a century. What archaeologists actually know. One archaeologist who examined the Ark question from a skeptical perspective was David Merling of Andrews University. Merling's work is particularly useful because it demonstrates why extraordinary claims require more than photographs and measurements. Earlier investigations found no authenticated ship timber embedded in the formation. Claims that chemical differences inside the formation proved the presence of ancient wood were also challenged. Merling noted that the reported carbon values fell within ranges that can occur naturally in soils, and therefore could not, by themselves, establish the existence of a wooden vessel. This distinction is critical. Finding organic material is not the same as finding a wooden ship. Finding iron-bearing minerals is not the same as finding iron fasteners. And finding straight-looking radar reflections is not automatically the same as finding walls. The geological case against the Ark interpretation became even stronger in a 1996 study by geologist Lawrence Collins and researcher David Fasold. Their analysis concluded that the boat-shaped structure was a natural geological formation involving weathered volcanic material, limonite, magnetite, and folded sedimentary layers. They also examined the famous stones that Ark researchers had interpreted as ancient anchors, and concluded that the stones were made from local volcanic rock rather than material transported from Mesopotamia. So, if the site is not an ark, what exactly is it? That remains the central geological question. The new investigation. Now the technology has changed. The current Durupanar research project, directed by archaeologist Professor Dr. Cenker Atilla of Sivas Cumhuriyet University, is using a combination of ground-penetrating radar, electrical resistivity tomography, LiDAR, aerial mapping, soil analysis, and planned core drilling. The goal is not simply to photograph the formation from above. The goal is to map what lies beneath it. And this is where the story becomes genuinely interesting. Ground-penetrating radar does not see an ancient ship directly. Instead, it sends electromagnetic pulses into the ground and records changes in the signals as they encounter materials with different physical properties. Those reflections can reveal boundaries, layers, fractures, voids, or changes in material density. At Durupanar, researchers have reported linear and angular subsurface reflections. The project has described corridor-like features, chamber-shaped anomalies, and repeated geometric patterns within the formation. Some of the reported features appear at depths of several meters, but there is a major caveat. Radar detects physical boundaries. It does not tell us whether those boundaries were created by human builders or by geological processes. That distinction still has to be demonstrated. In fact, earlier radar investigations produced interpretations that were subsequently disputed. This is why the new research is important. Not because it has already proven the arc, but because researchers are attempting to collect enough independent data to determine what the anomalies actually represent. The soil evidence. The soil evidence has attracted perhaps the greatest attention. Researchers associated with the current project have collected samples from inside and outside the boat-shaped formation. According to soil scientist William Crabtree, the interior samples contain substantially more organic matter than surrounding material, along with differences in potassium and pH. The researchers argue that these changes could be consistent with the long-term decomposition of organic material, including wood. That is a legitimate hypothesis. But it is still only a hypothesis. Organic matter can have many geological and biological sources. Soil chemistry can change because of vegetation, drainage, sediment composition, microbial activity, volcanic material, and countless other processes. For that reason, elevated organic content cannot independently identify an ancient wooden vessel. The researchers themselves say additional sampling and laboratory analysis are necessary. The current project reports that samples have been collected from numerous points and that further core drilling and geophysical surveys are planned. This is exactly how the evidence should be tested. If the anomaly is real, repeated samples should reproduce the same pattern. If the chemical signature truly comes from decomposed timber, independent laboratories should be able to identify evidence consistent with ancient wood. And if the structure is artificial, eventually its physical characteristics should distinguish it from the surrounding geology. The famous anchor stones. Then there are the stones. Near the Durupanar formation are large stones with holes cut through them. Arc researcher Ron Wyatt and salvage expert David Fassold interpreted these objects as ancient sea anchors or drogues. The idea is not completely impossible in principle. Ancient ships did use stone objects for various maritime purposes, and drilled stones are known archaeologically. But there is a crucial problem. The stones near Durupanar have been examined geologically, and the evidence indicates that they are made from local volcanic rock. That makes the argument that they were transported from Mesopotamia much weaker. It also means that the stones themselves cannot establish a connection with Noah's Ark. They are real archaeological objects. Their interpretation is the disputed part. The older flood evidence. And this is where the story becomes much larger than a single mountain, because there is strong archaeological evidence that ancient Mesopotamian societies experienced major floods. At several sites in southern Mesopotamia, archaeologists have discovered flood deposits dating to different periods. Ur has evidence for a major flood around 3,500 BCE. Kish contains evidence for multiple flooding episodes. And at Durupanar, one of the most important sites in the Mesopotamian flood tradition, archaeologists identified a flood layer dating roughly to the late 4th or early 3rd millennium BCE. These deposits do not prove Noah's Ark. They do not demonstrate a worldwide flood. But they demonstrate something important. Catastrophic flooding was a genuine experience for ancient communities living along the Tigris and Euphrates river system. And ancient Mesopotamian literature preserves that memory in extraordinary detail. Before Noah, there was Atrahasis. Long before the biblical story reached its present form, Mesopotamian scribes were recording flood narratives. One of the most important is the Epic of Atrahasis. In the story, the hero Atrahasis is warned about an approaching flood. He is instructed to build a vessel and preserve living things. The similarities with Genesis are striking. Another version appears in Tablet 11 of the Epic of Gilgamesh, where the flood survivor is called Utnapishtim. He builds a massive vessel, takes living creatures aboard, survives the flood, and eventually offers a sacrifice after the waters recede. These are not modern similarities invented by ark hunters. They are ancient cuneiform texts, and scholars studying the formation of Genesis generally recognize strong literary relationships between the biblical flood narrative and earlier Mesopotamian flood traditions. That does not make Genesis false. It tells us something more interesting. The biblical flood story belongs to a much older cultural world in which catastrophic flooding was already part of the collective memory and literature of the ancient Near East. So, where does Noah's Ark fit? This is where archaeology has to be extremely careful. There are several different levels of evidence. First, there is evidence that ancient Mesopotamia experienced devastating floods. Second, there is evidence that Mesopotamian cultures preserved detailed flood stories involving a survivor, a large boat, animals, and divine warning. Third, there is the biblical account of Noah, which contains striking parallels with those older traditions. Fourth, there are centuries of traditions placing the Ark somewhere in the mountains associated with Ararat or the broader region. And fifth, there is the Durupanar Formation, a genuine geological structure whose shape and dimensions have attracted Ark researchers for decades. But none of those 5 pieces, individually or collectively, has produced a verified archaeological Ark. That distinction matters. What about the radar? The newest radar evidence is perhaps the most exciting part of the investigation because it is testable. Researchers report repeated linear reflections and angular features beneath the formation. The current project has published images showing what it interprets as possible corridors, chambers, and internal divisions. But a geophysicist looking at the same data could potentially interpret those boundaries as geological layering, fractures, or other natural structures. This is not a minor disagreement. It is the entire scientific question. If the features are artificial, researchers should eventually be able to demonstrate characteristics that natural geology cannot adequately explain. If they are geological, independent surveys should reproduce the structures and show how the local geology produced them. The project itself recognizes this problem. Its stated objective is to determine whether the formation is natural or artificial, using multiple independent methods rather than relying on visual resemblance alone. The evidence that would change everything. There is one discovery that would transform this debate overnight. Not another photograph, not another radar image, not another soil sample. Actual archaeological material securely associated with the formation. A piece of preserved timber with a demonstrable archaeological context. A worked wooden beam. a manufactured fastening system, a human-made artifact found in an undisturbed layer, or, ideally, a sequence of structural materials that could be independently dated and demonstrated to belong to a single ancient vessel. That is the standard the Durupanar site has never yet reached. And until it does, the responsible conclusion is not that Noah's Ark has been found. The responsible conclusion is that an unusual formation is being investigated. The mystery is still alive. That may sound less dramatic than the headlines, but scientifically, it is far more interesting. Because the Durupanar formation is real. The radar anomalies are real observations. The soil differences reported by the current researchers are measurable claims. The ancient Mesopotamian flood traditions are real. The archaeological flood deposits are real. And the similarities between Genesis and earlier Mesopotamian flood literature are real. What remains unresolved is the connection between these pieces. Did an actual catastrophic flood inspire traditions that eventually became the stories of Atrahasis, Utnapishtim, and Noah? Was the biblical story shaped from older Mesopotamian traditions? Could a real ancient vessel still survive somewhere in the mountains? Or is Durupanar simply one of the most extraordinary examples of geology producing a shape that the human mind desperately wants to interpret? Archaeology has not answered those questions yet, and that is precisely why the investigation continues. The next stage is not another expedition searching for a miracle. It is deeper geophysical surveying, systematic soil analysis, core sampling, independent laboratory testing, and eventually the kind of archaeological evidence that can separate a compelling possibility from a historical discovery. Until then, the Durupanar formation remains exactly what the evidence allows us to call it: a remarkable boat-shaped geological formation, a site surrounded by one of humanity's oldest stories, and a mystery that science has not solved yet. Ron Wyatt, the man who went looking for the Ark. Long before modern radar systems and subsurface imaging were brought to Durupanar, one man had already become convinced that the search for Noah's Ark had reached its destination. His name was Ron Wyatt. Wyatt was not an archaeologist, geologist, or academic. He worked as a nurse anesthetist in Tennessee. Yet, beginning in the 1970s, he devoted much of his time and resources to investigating locations he believed were connected to events described in the Bible. His interest in Durupanar began with an aerial photograph. In 1977, Wyatt encountered an image of the unusual formation in eastern Turkey and became convinced that its distinctive outline represented Noah's Ark. From that point forward, he returned to the region repeatedly, developing a theory that would make him one of the most controversial figures in the modern Ark debate. Wyatt claimed that the formation contained evidence of an ancient vessel. He pointed to what he interpreted as petrified wood, metal objects, rib-like structures, and the large stones surrounding the formation. He also argued that chemical traces found in the area were consistent with the remains of a massive wooden structure and ancient metal components. But these interpretations were never accepted as proof by mainstream archaeology or geology. Researchers who examined the evidence raised serious objections. Some of the alleged wooden material could not be securely demonstrated to have come from an ancient ship. Mineral and metal concentrations could have geological explanations, and the supposed structural features could potentially be explained by the natural processes that formed the ridge itself. That distinction is important. Wyatt believed he was uncovering physical evidence of biblical history. His critics believed he was interpreting ambiguous geological features according to a conclusion he had already reached. And that disagreement followed him throughout his career. His claims extended far beyond Noah's Ark. Wyatt also announced discoveries that he believed were connected to the Ark of the Covenant, the Ten Commandments, Goliath, and the crucifixion of Jesus. Mainstream archaeologists did not accept these discoveries as authenticated archaeological evidence. Critics pointed to Wyatt's lack of formal archaeological training, the limited documentation accompanying some of his claims, and what they considered a tendency to interpret uncertain evidence through a predetermined biblical framework. His supporters saw the situation differently. They argued that Wyatt was being dismissed because his conclusions challenged conventional academic assumptions about biblical history. Whether one considers Wyatt a determined investigator or an overconfident interpreter, his impact on the Durupanar story is difficult to deny. He helped transform the formation from an obscure geological curiosity into one of the world's most famous alleged Ark sites. And his investigations kept public attention focused on the mountain long after the first scientific surveys had concluded that the formation was probably natural. But the search for Noah's Ark did not begin with Ron Wyatt. In fact, its history stretches back nearly 2,000 years. A long, strange history of Ark discoveries. If you think the search for Noah's Ark began with modern explorers, you are several centuries too late. One of the earliest surviving written references comes from the first-century Jewish historian Flavius Josephus. In his Antiquities of the Jews, Josephus described a tradition that remnants of the Ark could still be found in the mountains of Armenia. He also reported that people living in the region collected material from the supposed remains and treated it as something valuable. Josephus was not the only ancient writer to preserve such a tradition. The Babylonian historian Berossus, writing in the 3rd century BCE, also described a tradition in which remains of a great vessel were associated with the mountains of Armenia. Later, Christian writers, Byzantine authors, and Islamic scholars continued to associate the Ark with mountains in the region historically known as Armenia, and later associated with Mount Ararat. But there is an important point here. These accounts demonstrate the existence of an ancient Ark tradition. They do not demonstrate that anyone actually located the remains of the vessel. And the story itself is older than the biblical account as we know it. Long before the book of Genesis was compiled in its final form, Mesopotamian scribes were recording their own stories of catastrophic floods. One of the most important examples is the Epic of Gilgamesh. In its flood narrative, the hero Utnapishtim is warned that a devastating flood is coming. He is instructed to construct a large vessel, preserve living creatures, and survive the catastrophe. After the waters recede, he releases birds to determine whether the floodwaters have disappeared. The parallels with the story of Noah are striking, and they are not merely modern observations. The Babylonian flood tradition was written down centuries before the biblical text reached its present form. In 1872, the Assyriologist George Smith famously identified the flood story while studying cuneiform tablets in the British Museum. The discovery caused an enormous sensation in Victorian Britain because it revealed that a flood narrative remarkably similar to Genesis had existed in Mesopotamia long before the modern archaeological age. The discovery did not prove that Noah's Ark existed, but it transformed the historical study of the biblical flood. It showed that the story belonged to a much older Near Eastern tradition of flood narratives, and the similarities went even further. Another important Mesopotamian text, the Atrahasis epic, describes a man warned by the god Ea about an approaching flood. Atrahasis builds a vessel and preserves life aboard it. Again, the similarities are unmistakable. Rather than providing archaeological proof of Noah, these texts provide evidence that catastrophic flood stories were deeply embedded in the cultural memory and literature of ancient Mesopotamia. The flood behind the stories? Archaeology also provides another piece of the puzzle. Ancient Mesopotamia experienced devastating floods. At sites such as Kish, and Durupanar, archaeologists have discovered evidence of major flooding episodes. These deposits do not prove a worldwide flood. They do not prove Noah existed, and they certainly do not identify the remains of an ark. But they establish something important. For the people living between the Tigris and Euphrates, catastrophic flooding was not an imaginary concept. It was a real environmental danger. Entire settlements could be damaged or abandoned. Agricultural land could disappear beneath water and sediment. Communities could be displaced. Stories about catastrophic floods therefore had a very real cultural environment in which to develop. And over generations, historical experiences could become transformed into religious and literary traditions. This is one reason scholars approach the relationship between Mesopotamian flood literature and Genesis so carefully. The question is not simply, did the flood happen exactly as Genesis describes? The deeper archaeological question is how real environmental disasters, oral traditions, religious ideas, and ancient literature interacted over thousands of years, and that question remains open to interpretation. The search moves to the mountains. While scholars were examining ancient texts, explorers continued looking for physical evidence. For centuries, travelers in the region surrounding Mount Ararat reported stories of wooden remains, mysterious structures, and objects supposedly visible in the mountains. Some accounts described beams emerging from snow and ice. Others claimed to have seen large, artificial-looking shapes high on the mountain. But these reports were difficult to verify. Mount Ararat rises to approximately 5,137 meters above sea level. Its upper slopes are covered by glaciers, volcanic rock, snow, and rapidly changing shadows. Extreme weather can make exploration dangerous, while seasonal snow and ice can expose and conceal the landscape repeatedly. That makes eyewitness testimony particularly difficult to evaluate. A dark shape visible from a distance can appear remarkably artificial from one angle and completely natural from another. And throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, this pattern repeated. A photograph would appear. A traveler would report a strange object. An expedition would be announced. Then researchers would arrive and discover that the evidence was either inaccessible, ambiguous, or impossible to reproduce. The mystery survived because every new claim seemed to contain just enough uncertainty to keep the question alive. The Cold War comes to Ararat. After World War II, the search for the Ark acquired an entirely new dimension. The mountain became surrounded by stories of secret military reconnaissance. During the 1950s and 1960s, rumors circulated that American reconnaissance aircraft had photographed mysterious objects on Mount Ararat. Because aircraft such as the U-2 were conducting highly classified missions during the Cold War, the idea that intelligence agencies might possess secret photographs of the Ark quickly became part of popular mythology. According to the rumors, the United States government knew that something resembling a ship was frozen into the mountain, but was deliberately withholding the evidence. The story was irresistible. The Ark had supposedly become a Cold War secret. But when photographs and satellite imagery were examined more critically, many supposed Ark shapes proved to be ordinary geological features, shadows, ice formations, or combinations of rock and snow. The problem was not necessarily that people were lying. Human beings are exceptionally good at recognizing familiar shapes in ambiguous images. Give the brain a blurry photograph and tell it to look for a ship, and suddenly ridges, shadows, and fractures can begin to resemble decks, hulls, and walls. Mount Ararat is particularly well suited to producing such illusions. Its enormous slopes create dramatic contrasts between snow, volcanic rock, ice, and shadow. A feature that appears unmistakably ship-like under one combination of sunlight and snow can look completely different months later. But the failure of these images to produce definitive evidence did not end the search. It redirected it. And in 1959, attention shifted toward a completely different formation.